"I'll take everything from you," my husband said in court, his voice calm, almost bored, as if he were discussing the weather instead of dismantling 42 years of my life. I looked at him, really looked. The same man who once held my hand across a crowded diner table in Ohio, promising we would grow old together. The same man who used to bring me coffee every Sunday morning, exactly the way I liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, as if I had expected those words all along. The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of artificial chill that seeps into your bones. My attorney shifted beside me, waiting for a reaction, but I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. They didn't tremble. Not anymore. Across the room, Richard adjusted his cufflinks, a small, precise movement that told me everything I needed to know. He thought he had already won. That was his first mistake. 3 days earlier, I had stood in the kitchen of the house we built together, staring at the marble countertop he insisted on installing 10 years ago. It gleamed under the morning light, flawless, expensive, and cold, just like the man I was about to divorce. I remember running my fingers along its surface, thinking how strange it was that something so beautiful could feel so empty. That morning, I signed a document. Not the one he thought I would sign. Not the one his lawyer had prepared so carefully, designed to leave me with just enough to disappear quietly. No, this was something else. Something older. Something he had forgotten. Back in the courtroom, the judge asked a routine question, something about asset disclosure, but I barely heard it. My eyes stayed on Richard. He didn't look at me. Not once. Instead, he leaned toward his attorney, whispering with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already written. I almost smiled. Not out of bitterness. Not even out of anger. But because, for the first time in a very long time, I understood exactly who he was. And more importantly, I understood exactly what he had overlooked. The house felt different after that morning, as if it already knew I was leaving. Even before the papers were filed, I moved through each room slowly, not to say goodbye, but to remember. The living room still held the faint scent of the leather polish Richard insisted on using every Sunday, a ritual he never missed, even when everything else between us had begun to fade. I paused by the window, the one that overlooked the backyard where we had planted a maple tree the year Daniel was born. It was tall now, strong, its branches stretching far beyond the fence line. I wondered when it had grown so much without me noticing. That was the thing about time. It did not announce itself when it changed everything. It simply moved forward, quietly, while you were busy believing things would stay the same. 2 days before the court hearing, I opened the safe in the study. The code had not changed in over 20 years. Richard always said there was no need. He trusted routine more than he trusted people. Inside, the documents were exactly where I expected them to be, neatly stacked, labeled in his precise handwriting. Property deeds, investment accounts, insurance policies. The life we built, reduced to paper. I took out one folder, thinner than the rest, almost insignificant at first glance. He had not touched it in years. I could tell by the slight layer of dust along the edge. That folder contained something he had long forgotten, something he had once signed without a second thought, back when we were still a team instead of opponents sitting across a courtroom. I placed it carefully on the desk and ran my hand over the cover, feeling the weight of it settle into my palm. Not heavy in ounces, but in consequence. That afternoon, Richard came home earlier than usual. He did not notice me in the study. He rarely did anymore. His attention had been elsewhere for a long time, scattered across meetings, calls, and conversations that never included me. I listened as he moved through the house, his footsteps confident, assured. The sound of a man who believed everything was still under his control. I closed the folder and returned it to the safe exactly as I found it. Then I locked it, not to protect it from him, but to make sure he would never think to look. Again, some victories do not begin with confrontation. They begin with patience. And I had been patient for a very long time. I noticed her before she spoke. Vanessa was sitting in the second row behind Richard, her posture perfect, her expression carefully composed, like someone attending a performance she had already seen before. She did not belong in that courtroom, not officially, but somehow she had become a constant presence in everything that used to be mine. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, and in that second, I saw it clearly. Not guilt, not even discomfort, just calculation. I looked away first, not because I was intimidated, but because I had already seen enough. There was no need to study the obvious any longer. 2 weeks ago, she had come to the house unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Richard had been in his study, leaving me to entertain her. We sat at the kitchen island, the same place where I had once helped her choose wedding invitations, back when she still called me mom with something that sounded almost genuine. She talked about renovations, about expanding the house, about future plans that did not include me, but were built entirely on what I had helped create. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting her speak as if none of it unsettled me. Then she said something small, something easy to miss. She mentioned accounts, casually, as if discussing the weather. Specific accounts, ones I had never told her about. That was when everything shifted. I remember setting my glass down very carefully, making sure it did not make a sound against the marble. I asked a simple question, nothing confrontational, nothing that would alert her. She answered too quickly, too confidently. People always reveal more than they intend when they believe they are in control. Later that evening, after she left, I sat alone at the kitchen table and replayed every word she had said. Every pause, every glance. It was all there, laid out in quiet pieces that finally fit together. Richard had not built this plan alone. He never could. He had always relied on someone to guide him, to sharpen his decisions, to push him further than he would go on his own. And now I knew exactly who that someone was. Back in the courtroom, Vanessa leaned slightly forward, whispering something to Daniel, who sat beside her looking uncomfortable in a way that felt almost distant, as if he were watching a situation he did not fully understand. I held my gaze steady on the judge, but I could feel the shift in the room. They thought they were orchestrating the outcome. They thought I was still a step behind, trying to catch up. What they did not realize was that I had already moved ahead. I had seen the pattern. I had followed the trail, and I had already decided how this would end. There was a time when I believed every promise he made without question. I can still remember the way Richard used to look at me across the dinner table, his eyes steady, his voice certain, telling me that everything we built would always belong to both of us. He liked to say that we were partners in every sense of the word, that nothing would ever come between us. I believed him then. I believed him when we signed the mortgage on our first home, a modest 2-bedroom house with creaky floors and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left. I believed him when we opened our first joint account, depositing checks that barely covered the bills but still felt like the beginning of something solid. And I believed him years later, when success came and everything grew larger, more polished, more impressive. The house changed. The cars changed. Even the people around us changed. But I thought we had not. Looking back, I can see the moments I missed. The small shifts that did not seem important at the time. The way he started making decisions without asking me, presenting them as finished conclusions rather than conversations. The way documents began appearing with his signature already in place, my role reduced to acknowledgement instead of agreement. At first, I told myself it was practical. He handled business matters. I handled the home. That was how we had always divided things. It felt natural, comfortable, safe, until it was not. I remember one evening, maybe 10 years ago, when he brought home a set of papers and asked me to sign them quickly because he was running late for a meeting. I did not read them carefully. I trusted him. I signed where he pointed, just as I had done dozens of times before. He kissed my cheek, thanked me, and walked out the door. I went back to washing dishes, thinking nothing of it. That memory came back to me with unsettling clarity as I sat in the courtroom, listening to his lawyer describe our assets as if they had appeared out of thin air, as if they were the result of his effort alone. I did not interrupt. I did not correct them. I simply let the words settle in the air, knowing how easily narratives can be constructed when no one challenges them. Across the room, Richard finally glanced in my direction, just for a second. There was confidence in his expression, the kind that comes from years of believing you understand every variable in the equation. He still thought I was part of the past he had already rewritten. He still thought I had not noticed when the partnership ended and the strategy began. But I remembered everything now. Not just the promises. Not just the love. I remembered the papers. And this time, I knew exactly what they meant. It was not the courtroom that changed everything. It was the phone call I almost ignored the night before. I remember staring at the screen as it rang, the unfamiliar number lighting up in the quiet of the living room. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. I was tired, not in a physical way, but in the deeper sense that comes from carrying too many realizations at once. Still, something made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and oddly familiar. Michael Grant. The name took a second to settle into place, but when it did, I sat up straighter. He had handled a small legal matter for us years ago, something minor that I barely remembered, but his voice carried the same steady confidence I recalled from that time. He did not waste words. He asked if I had a moment to talk, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a casual check-in. I told him yes. He paused briefly, as if choosing his next sentence with care, and then he said something that shifted everything. He asked me if I had personally reviewed all of the documents Richard had presented in preparation for the divorce. I answered honestly, no. There was silence on the line, not awkward, but deliberate. The kind of silence that allows truth to settle before it is spoken. Then he explained, not in dramatic terms, not with accusations, but with facts. Transactions that did not align. Transfers that had been structured in ways that would be difficult to trace without knowing exactly where to look. Accounts that had been moved, renamed, or quietly repositioned over time. It was not a sudden act. It was a pattern. Careful. Calculated. Years in the making. I listened without interrupting, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, my breathing steady. When he finished, he did not tell me what to do. He simply said that if I wanted clarity, he could show me where to look. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, letting the information arrange itself in my mind. It was not shock that I felt, not even anger. It was something quieter. Recognition. The pieces I had been collecting were no longer scattered. They formed a clear picture now, one that no longer depended on guesswork or suspicion. The next morning, I called him back. Not to ask questions, not to express disbelief, but to say two simple words. Show me. Back in the courtroom, I adjusted my sleeve slightly, the fabric smooth beneath my fingers. Richard was still speaking with his attorney, still moving through the process with the ease of someone who believed the outcome had already been secured. He did not know that I had already stepped into a different version of this story, one where I was no longer reacting, one where I was finally prepared. I did not confront him. That was the part that surprised even me. After everything Michael had shown me, after every detail fell into place with quiet precision, there was no urge to argue, no need to demand explanations. Confrontation would have given him something to respond to, something to adjust. Instead, I chose silence. The kind that reveals more than any accusation ever could. That evening, when Richard returned home, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner as usual. The same routine, the same calm movements. He loosened his tie, placed his briefcase by the door, and greeted me with a brief nod that felt more like habit than intention. I asked him how his day had been. He said it was productive. Nothing unusual. We sat down at the table, and I watched him the way I used to watch our son when he was young, trying to understand what he was not saying rather than what he was. Richard spoke about the case with confidence, outlining what he expected to happen, how straightforward everything would be, how the court would see reason. I listened. I agreed at the right moments. I even asked a few careful questions, just enough to encourage him to keep talking. People always reveal more when they feel understood. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and said something that almost sounded like reassurance. He told me I would be taken care of, that there was no need to worry, that everything was already arranged. I nodded slowly, letting the words settle between us. Arranged. That was the word he chose. Not shared. Not discussed. Arranged. After dinner, I cleared the plates while he moved into the living room, turning on the television, already detached from the conversation we had just finished. I stood at the sink, the warm water running over my hands, and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not because I was pleased, but because I finally understood the structure of his thinking. He did not see me as a participant anymore. He saw me as an outcome, something to be managed, calculated, and placed neatly within the boundaries he had created. Later that night, I reviewed the documents Michael had sent me, line by line, carefully. No assumptions, no shortcuts. The numbers told their own story, one that Richard believed was hidden behind complexity and time. But patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. Transfers repeated in cycles. Accounts linked through subtle connections. It was all there, waiting for someone patient enough to follow it through. I closed the file and set it aside, my mind steady, my decision already made. In the morning, I would not challenge him. I would not resist. I would give him exactly what he expected. Because sometimes, the most effective way to change the outcome is to let the other person believe they already control it. I agreed to everything. That was the part no one questioned. When Richard's attorney presented the proposed terms, outlining them with that polished, confident tone, I listened carefully and then nodded as if each point made perfect sense. The division of assets, the restructuring of accounts, the reassignment of properties. It was all delivered as though it had already been decided long before I walked into that courtroom. When the judge turned to me and asked if I understood the terms, I answered clearly. Yes. When I was asked if I needed clarification, I declined. No. My attorney glanced at me, just briefly, a flicker of hesitation in his expression, but I gave him nothing to work with. No resistance. No objection. Just quiet acceptance. Across the room, I saw the shift in Richard's posture. Subtle, but unmistakable. His shoulders relaxed. His movements became more fluid, less guarded. This was the version of events he had prepared for. The one where I remained exactly as he had defined me. Predictable. Passive. Contained. Vanessa leaned slightly toward him, her expression composed but satisfied, as if confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan. Daniel, on the other hand, looked down at his hands, his fingers interlocked in a way that suggested discomfort he could not quite name. I noticed it, but I did not dwell on it. This was not his decision to make. This had never been about him. The judge instructed both parties to review and sign the preliminary agreement before final proceedings. Papers were passed across the table, smooth, official, final in appearance. I took the pen when it was offered to me. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. I did not rush. I read just enough to maintain the illusion. Then I signed. My name, steady and deliberate, exactly where they expected it to be. No hesitation. No visible doubt. When I finished, I placed the pen down gently and folded my hands once more in my lap. It was done, at least from their perspective. Richard exhaled slowly, a controlled release of tension that he probably did not even realize he had been holding. He looked at me then, directly, for the first time since the hearing began. There was something almost like relief in his expression, mixed with quiet triumph. He believed this was the moment everything settled into place. He believed I had accepted the outcome he had designed. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, not to challenge him, not to confront him, but to confirm something for myself. He truly did not see it. Not the pattern, not the detail, not the one thing that had never been his to control. I looked away first, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I already knew what would happen next. The room did not change, but the air did. It always does when something invisible begins to shift. The judge moved on to procedural details, voices blending into a steady rhythm of legal language. But I could feel the moment approaching with quiet certainty. Michael sat beside me, his posture composed, his expression neutral in a way that concealed more than it revealed. He did not look at me, and I did not look at him. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had already been understood. Richard's attorney continued speaking, outlining next steps with the confidence of someone closing a case rather than entering its most critical phase. Papers were being organized, signatures verified, timelines confirmed. It all appeared orderly, predictable, final. I rested my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the present moment. Across from me, Richard leaned back slightly, one arm draped over the back of his chair, his expression calm, almost satisfied. Vanessa mirrored that stillness, her gaze fixed forward, her lips pressed into a faint, controlled smile. They both believed the difficult part was over. That belief was necessary. Without it, none of this would have worked. Michael cleared his throat, a small, deliberate sound that did not interrupt the flow of the room, but redirected it. He spoke only when there was space, when the rhythm allowed it, and when he did, his voice was steady, measured, and impossible to ignore. He requested permission to submit an additional document into evidence. There was a brief pause, a glance from the judge, a nod. Simple, procedural, routine. But nothing about this was routine. I watched as he opened the folder, the same one I had taken from the safe, the one that had waited quietly for years, untouched and underestimated. He placed the document on the table with care, sliding it forward just enough for it to enter the shared space between both sides. Richard's attention shifted then, just slightly, drawn by the movement more than the content. At first, there was no reaction. Why would there be? To him, it was just another piece of paper, another formality, another step in a process he believed he had already mastered. But then Michael began to speak again, this time not outlining, not summarizing, but explaining. Dates, signatures, terms that had been established long before the current proceedings ever began. I did not need to look at Richard to know when he understood. It was not something you saw immediately. It was something you felt, like a change in pressure, subtle but undeniable. The confidence that had filled the room moments earlier did not disappear all at once. It faltered. It adjusted. It searched for footing. I remained still, my expression unchanged, my hands resting exactly where they had been from the start. This was not the moment for reaction. This was the moment for truth to unfold on its own. And for the first time since this process began, the story was no longer being told by him. The words settled slowly, like dust in a room that had just been disturbed. Michael did not rush. He never did. He allowed each detail to land with its full weight, each date aligned with precision, each signature placed exactly where it could no longer be dismissed as incidental. The document was not new. That was the part that mattered most. It had existed for years, quietly binding decisions that Richard had long since convinced himself he controlled. A postnuptial agreement, signed willingly, witnessed properly, filed correctly, terms that had been clear from the beginning, even if they had been forgotten over time. I watched as Richard leaned forward, his posture no longer relaxed, his attention fixed on the paper in front of him as if seeing it for the first time. His attorney reached for it quickly, scanning the pages with increasing urgency, the smooth confidence from earlier replaced by something sharper, more cautious. Vanessa shifted in her seat, just slightly, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. These were small movements, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. But I had spent years paying attention to what others overlooked. Michael continued, outlining the specific clause that changed everything. The one that addressed asset ownership in the event of a dissolution of marriage. The one that ensured that any property, any account, any investment established during the marriage under joint contribution would remain protected under my name if certain conditions were met. Conditions that had now, unmistakably, been met. There was no accusation in his voice. No dramatics. Just fact layered upon fact, building something that could not be undone by argument alone. Richard's attorney spoke then, attempting to redirect, to question the applicability, the timing, the interpretation. It was expected, necessary even, but the foundation had already been established. The judge listened carefully, asking precise questions, reviewing the document with the same measured attention that had defined the entire proceeding. I remained still, my hands folded, my breathing even, my gaze steady. This was not about proving a point. It was about allowing the truth to stand without interference. Richard finally looked at me again, but this time there was no certainty in his expression, no quiet triumph, only a searching look, as if trying to understand when the narrative had shifted beyond his control. I did not look away, not this time. I held his gaze just long enough to let him see what he had missed all along. Not anger, not resentment, just clarity, because this was never about taking something from him. It was about protecting what had always been mine. The shift was no longer subtle. It moved through the room with a quiet force that did not need to announce itself. The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the document again, this time with a deeper focus, as if the entire structure of the case had just been rewritten in front of him. Questions followed, not rushed, not emotional, but precise, each one narrowing the space Richard had been standing on. Michael answered calmly, referencing dates, filings, and the legal validity of the agreement without hesitation. There was no need to raise his voice. The strength of the argument did not rely on volume. Across the table, Richard's attorney adjusted his glasses, flipping through pages more quickly now, searching for something that could restore the balance that had just been lost. But balance, once disrupted by truth, does not return easily. Richard sat still, but it was a different kind of stillness than before. Not relaxed, not confident. It was the stillness of someone recalculating in real time, trying to understand how a detail he had dismissed had now become central to everything. Vanessa's composure began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. Her shoulders tightened. Her gaze dropped briefly to the table before lifting again, as if searching for confirmation that this was still manageable. It was not. The judge spoke again, this time addressing both sides directly, outlining how the newly presented document affected the distribution of assets. The language was formal, measured, but the meaning was clear. The foundation of Richard's claim had weakened. Significantly. I did not move. I did not react. My hands remained folded, my posture unchanged, as if I were simply observing a process that no longer required my intervention. Because that was the truth. This moment did not belong to me. It belonged to the facts that had been ignored for too long. Richard finally spoke, his voice controlled but edged with something unfamiliar. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief. He questioned the timing, the relevance, the interpretation. He tried to reshape the narrative, to pull it back into something he recognized. But the structure had already shifted. The judge listened, then responded with the same steady tone, acknowledging the argument but not altering the direction. That was the moment it became irreversible. Not because of anything dramatic, but because the process had moved beyond his influence. I allowed myself a single breath, slow and even, feeling the weight of years settle and then lift in the same quiet motion. Across from me, Richard looked at the document again, as if it might change if he stared at it long enough. But paper does not change. Signatures do not disappear. And truth, once placed on record, does not step aside for convenience. The decision did not come with a dramatic pause or a raised voice. It came the way most irreversible things do, quietly and with finality. The judge reviewed the document one last time, then set it down with a controlled, deliberate motion that seemed to settle the entire room. His words were clear, structured, and precise, outlining how the previously signed agreement must be honored as part of the legal framework governing the case. There was no ambiguity left to interpret. No space left for adjustment. The terms that Richard had relied on, the ones he had built his confidence around, no longer held the weight he believed they did. I watched as the understanding reached him fully, not all at once, but in stages. First in his posture, which lost its ease entirely. Then in his expression, where certainty gave way to something tighter, more contained. His attorney leaned in, speaking in a low voice, pointing at specific sections of the document. But it was no longer a discussion about strategy. It was about limitation. About what could still be preserved, rather than what could be taken. Vanessa sat very still, her composure intact on the surface, but her hands now clasped together in a way that suggested tension she could not disguise. Daniel shifted in his seat again, his gaze fixed on the table, as if distancing himself from the outcome he had never fully understood. The judge continued, outlining the adjusted distribution of assets based on the enforceable agreement, ensuring that ownership aligned with the original legal intent. It was methodical, balanced, unemotional, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. I did not interrupt. I did not respond. There was nothing left to argue. The structure had been restored, not by force, but by recognition of what had always existed beneath the surface. When the final clarification was given, the room settled into a different kind of silence. Not uncertainty, not tension, resolution. Richard looked at me again, but this time there was no question in his expression, only realization. The version of events he had constructed no longer held. The outcome he had anticipated was no longer possible. I met his gaze briefly, not to confirm his loss, but to acknowledge the truth that had finally reached him. Then I looked forward again, my posture unchanged, my hands still resting calmly in my lap. Because in the end, this was never about winning. It was about not losing what was never his to take. When the hearing ended, no one spoke right away. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. The quiet mechanics of closure moved through the room, but I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the stillness to settle completely. It was not relief that I felt, not triumph, just a quiet sense of alignment. As if something that had been slowly drifting out of place for years had finally returned to where it belonged. I stood, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve, and turned toward the aisle without looking back immediately. There was nothing left to check, nothing left to confirm. The outcome had already spoken for itself. As I walked toward the exit, I passed Richard. He did not stop me. He did not speak. For a brief second, I felt his presence beside me, not as the man I had once known, but as someone I could now see clearly, without memory softening the edges. I did not slow down. Outside, the air felt different. Cooler. Cleaner. I took a slow breath, letting it fill my lungs fully, something I had not realized I had been holding back. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm, cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause or acknowledgement of what had just ended inside that building. And that was exactly as it should be. Some endings are not meant to be witnessed. They are meant to be understood. I walked to my car, the same one I had driven for years, and paused with my hand on the door handle. For a moment, I saw everything as it had been. The early mornings, the shared plans, the version of us that once felt permanent. Then I let it go, not with anger, not with regret, just with clarity, because what we had built was real, but so was what it had become, and I no longer needed to carry both at the same time. I got into the car and closed the door gently, the sound final but not harsh. As I started the engine, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the one who had walked into that courtroom. She was steadier, quieter, certain in a way that did not need to be proven. I adjusted the mirror slightly, not to change what I saw, but to center it. Then I drove forward, not away from something, but toward a version of my life that no longer depended on anyone else to define its value. I did not lose my marriage. I finally saw it for what it was,